So Eumeswil is the book and topic that we're doing today, right? So we know that this is his one of his last works. I believe it's like last work. He published it just a few years before he died, but it talks about his very mature philosophy. Almost a complete opposite of who he was during World War One. And like the other book we're doing, the Brothers Karamazov, we decided to go chapter by chapter, chapters by chapters, and we're gonna talk about some of the underlying core components of the designated readings. And as we agreed on, we're gonna talk about three things, right? We're gonna talk about the Anarch, right? What that is, how it's different from anarchy, what his relationship to the society and the state is. That's the first thing. And then we're going to talk about the significance of history, right? He's a historian. Why is history so important to him? Yada, yada, yada. And finally, we're going to talk about language and culture and how that basically changes the way people conceptualize things, how language is controlled, all that jazz. And as James suggested, if we have time, we're going to maybe look at Eumeswil from a very meta perspective and really just describe what society kind of is. That seems like a good place to start, yeah?
That seems perfect, yep.
Sure.
All right, so let us get to the beginning. So we agreed to talk about the Anarch. And I guess a good place to start is what it's not, right? So, I guess I'm not the only one when I say, I'm reading this very niche philosopher, and he talks about this thing called the Anarch, and then other people will say, oh, so he's an anarchist, things like that. So, I guess let's clarify some things a bit as to just what the Anarch is. And from my readings, from what I read, it's a very apolitical person that has no allegiance to any certain ideology or a government, mainly on the basis that if you decide to put your allegiance towards them, your own personal autonomy is kind of taken away. And that's my take, but what say you?
Yeah, I think that's pretty spot on. I think the sort of central theme of the Anarch is that you yourself are sovereign over yourself. You're sort of a monarch unto yourself and no one else. You don't get into any kind of ideology, or you don't get any kind of ideology or any kind of deep political thinking beyond yourself, essentially.
Yeah, I have to agree. It seems to me as though the anarch basically means that there is no higher power to yourself other than yourself. So he kind of describes that most people are anarchists, but some people aren't, which is kind of interesting. But he didn't really touch up on that too thoroughly. He just defined what the anarch was, and what the anarchy, or excuse me, what the anarch wasn't.
It's interesting. He kind of says that all men are originally born as anarchs, and through time they essentially have restrictions placed upon them that sort of transform them into, what shall we say, into restrictive figures. So essentially,
Subjects.
subjects. It kind of says that, like he describes Christ as being, an anarch, and St. Paul is, of course, not an anarch, right? There's very clearly an ideology there. The anarch is, in a sense, infinite possibilities that can essentially, it never really forms into anything concrete. And so when you're sort of born, you sort of have this, the spirit within you that can transform into basically anything. And you have it at all times, right? It's like an energy that you can kind of bring up the well, so to speak, and you can sort of tap into. And Junger's trying to say that, if you sort of live in that state permanently, then you can kind of survive in these incredibly complex and destructive political scenes, which is very much, that's not exactly what Eumeswil is, but it's kind of hinted that that's what Eumeswil was created out of.
Yeah, I mean, it's mentioned here and there that it's a tyranny, right? It's a tyrannical government. And even, if you look at synopsis, it tells you that it's in a post-apocalyptic world. So there are some dark aspects to it, and Jünger is basically advocating that, or he's arguing rather, that as soon as you subscribe to an ism, right, that's when you kind of lose that control over yourself. And as soon as you fight for a higher ideology, then your whole meaning of your whole identity is now dependent on that, and you best hope that ideology, whatever you're fighting for, is on your side. And I guess Jünger learns this from his own life experiences, right? He was a very strong nationalist, and he kind of realized where that could go. And in that sense, he kind of understood that he should be more careful with where he puts his trust in, where he subscribes to, and so he wants to center it around himself more so. I would say.
Yeah, there's Junger's very like Heidegger in that there's basically two versions of him. There's basically pre-Nazi Germany Jünger, and there's post-Nazi Germany Jünger, and they're very different people, right? The writings of Jünger pre-1939 are very aggressive. They're very militaristic. They're essentially searching for a very, very deep meaning. If you've ever read his text, The Worker, or Total Mobilization, or On Pain, these are very, very deep and very, very complex, soul-searching pieces of literature. And then when you get to this, right, it's almost the entire opposite, right? It's very much withdrawn. It's very aristocratic. It's very beautiful in its prose. It's very down to earth. It's very, very, very strange to sort of read these two, to read the two Jüngers back to back, if you ever attempt that. But getting back to the Anarch, yes, he definitely learned a lot from. This book, like we said, is very much a culmination of his thought, and it's definitely true that he drew from his own life experience when designing the Anarch.
I want to get to a little bit on basically. Hold on, right here. I have it. I have the notes scribbled in the margins, but I don't write the neatest, so I can't even recognize my own writing. But I guess
I have that problem too.
Yeah, I guess I want to get into the whole where you mentioned how Christ is an anarch, and then so and so is not, right? And he goes on of giving all these examples about how the warrior is an anarch, but the soldier is not. Love is the warrior is anarchic, but love is no, but the soldier is not. Love is anarchic, but marriage is not, so on and so forth. And what do you make of that? Do you think that kind of relates to how you said the anarch is this vague energy that you kind of tap into, and as soon as you try to solidify it, it kind of loses that magic?
Exactly.
Do you kind of agree with that?
Exactly, yeah. I think that the Anarch, in a sense, is sort of like you say, it's kind of a primal energy. It's something we're all born with. I think the word possibilities is very very good. That's kind of a Deleuzian term, where you have this sort of space that could literally morph into anything, right? Like love is such a strange thing. It could literally turn into 1,000 different ends. It could become so many different things. But marriage is very, not that I'm shitting on marriage or anything. I don't think Jünger was too, but that's a very specific thing, right? You're married to one person, and there's a whole bunch of signs and symbols and responsibilities that come with that. When something like love is just chaotic in a sense, right? It can move in 1,000 different directions.
I think it's also important to note that the I guess dichotomies that he draws, the warrior and the soldier, love and marriage, that's a direct dichotomy of chaos and order. So the warrior is chaotic in that he chooses to fight no matter where he is. So that would kind of be like the condottieri that he references a lot. They're basically mercenaries, but then the soldier fights for a country and only when that country demands him to. And same with marriage. It's like you can love pretty much anyone, right, at any time. But marriage, you have to restrict your romantic love to one person. So it's very much a dichotomy of chaos and order.
I think you said mercenary there, and I think that's a very good word to bring in here, because the Anarch, in a sense, is a little mercenary. Because, of course, a mercenary is loyal only to himself, right, or to coin, to gold, but largely he's loyal to himself, and that's kind of what the Anarch is, right? He can rent himself out, like Emmanuel rents himself out to the Condor, right? He works for him, he works in the Kashba, he works at the bar, he studies at the Luminar under Bruno, I'm sure we'll get to soon, but he himself is essentially only renting himself out to this place, to the Condor. He may even like the Condor, right? He may even love the Condor, but he's never going to totally give himself over to him, right? He's not a soldier of the Condor. Or even a follower. He's a mercenary.
I wanna raise that point you said on chaos, right? And I want to raise that first, and then I want to get to the whole mercenary part, because I want to talk about two distinct things here. So, with the chaos part, it's very interesting that I think the whole point of him being chaotic and, kind of formless almost, I think is directly related to the seemingly opposite concept about how he needs authority, right? He says, also, I am an anarch, I am not anti-authoritarian. Quite the opposite, I need authority, although I do not believe in it. And I think it's kind of how, when you are chaotic, you kind of need a overarching structure to be chaotic in it, right? If there's no borders, then you can't really be chaotic. It's only when there's a chessboard that you can move wherever you want on the wherever you want on the board with your chess pieces. And I want to know if that's the right take here, because I just thought of it myself. And he hints at, because he hints at this throughout the story, right? So literally on the first page, he talks about how there's a sculpture and the marble, and you kind of need both to. The sculpture at first confronts the raw block, the pure material. So you could almost say that the raw block, is kind of the authority, and then you could do what you want with it, with your own self. Would you say that's an accurate interpretation? Because it might be confusing to some as to why he's so freedom loving, but then, anti-authoritarian. Or actually, no, freedom loving, but then so not anti-authoritarian, that he needs it.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think that one of the sort of central themes that sort of goes through all of Jünger's work, even right back to the beginning, actually, now that I think about it, is that any kind of freedom worth having has to exist within a sort of functioning social order. Like, he doesn't have anything good to say about the anarchists, right? He completely rejects them. They just destroy things, and there's literally even an anarch could barely survive within an anarchist society because they just destroy everything. And you need some order there in order for which to exist in, right? Because the anarch, essentially, he's free, but he keeps that freedom hidden, right? It's like a precious work of art that he keeps in his house, and sometimes you have to hide that under the floorboards, or sometimes you have to stow it away, but it's always there, and as long as you know it's there, then you're essentially free. And that's completely different from the anarchist. But if your house burns to the ground, right, then everything's wrecked then. So yes, there does have to be some kind of order for any kind of freedom to exist in, and that's something that anarchists just never understand.
I mean, he says, right, if I were an anarchist and nothing further, they would have easily exposed me. So that really ties into how you said that he kind of has to keep it hidden. But there's a very fine line here that you have to draw, because when the anarchists wants to destroy the state, part of it, if not the entirety of what they're doing, is based on the reason that they see the state as some oppressive force. They see it as too intrusive, if you will, too controlling, too oppressive, all that jazz. And we have to admit that the anarch is really walking a fine line here, because he is able to survive and make his way, but that's only because he's competent. That's only because he is he has skills that he can profit from, right? He works for the Condor, I believe. He's a historian. If he didn't have that, if he was of no use to society, there's a very good chance that he could have been outcasted, which would have potentially made him an anarchist, right? So you could argue that it's not because he finds the anarchists wrong that he's an anarch, but rather that he can live better as an anarch than as an anarchist. If he couldn't live as an anarch, there's a very high chance that he could have been an anarchist. Do you catch my drift here?
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying to a certain extent. I would say that sort of the mindset of Emmanuel would sort of never allow him to be an anarchist. I think he would just sort of leave the city, or I don't know, beg on the street or something. I don't know if he could ever. I think the temperament is quite different. The sort of the tragic view of history that sort of soaks through this whole novel and through the character, which is something the anarchists never have. Right? They have a very, what would you call it, idealist, not ideal in the sense of literally the word ideal, not idealism, but they have a very ideal view of what humanity could be. And
utopian.
Yes, sorry, that's the word I was looking for. Yes, thank you very much. They have a very utopian view of what the Earth could be, and sort of that infects everything. And I don't see how you could ever be an anarchist without having some sense of that. You could become essentially just a criminal, right? You probably become a criminal. I think he even said at one point that I can't remember the line, but he said something about if he wasn't this, he might be a criminal.
Yeah, that is true. So maybe I should take it back, because even the criminal understands the necessity of the state. Otherwise, he wouldn't have anything to commit a crime against. If there's no law, and if there's nothing to enforce the law, which is basically the state, then you can't really be a criminal. So I would have to agree with you there, and he would much rather be a criminal than an anarchist, I guess.
Mm-hmm, I think so.
You can go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing. Please go ahead.
All right. I think it's important to note that he draws like dichotomies when he's describing the anarch, right? And I think that when he does that, I think he's alluding to the fact that the value of the dichotomies. You can't have good without evil. You can't have anarchy without order. And I guess my interpretation, or at least from what I understand from the book, is that he needs sort of a governmental figure or an authoritative figure in order to value his own anarchy in himself. I'm not entirely sure if I phrased that right, but let me know if you guys get what I'm saying.
No, I think you're exactly right, and don't forget that Emmanuel, or Martin as he's also called, he likes history, right? He likes history, he likes beautiful things, he likes philosophy, and you can't have those things, right, if everything's destroyed. And he even says, he prefers the Kashba, right? He prefers the Condor to the tribunes who were originally ruled Eumeswil. and they were very much, you're very much Jünger's stand-in for liberal democracy, right? And they're kind of, they ruled from the city. They sort of, kind of a description of modern liberal states. They're very boring, very uninterested in beauty. While the Condor, for all his faults, he even changes people's names to sound better, and he lives in this beautiful palace, and he goes on these grand hunts. And you can dislike the Condor, you can dislike tyranny or whatever, but if you're someone like Emmanuel, then you need that. If you're going to have, you need someone there to sort of build these beautiful things and keep them going. And so he prefers the Kashba, and I think he recognizes that the things that he values couldn't exist outside of this kind of society, and also that hoping for any kind of utopia where you can get everything that you want is completely ahistorical. And this book literally opens up with a passage that I forgot, which is great, that he says that creation must have begun with a fraud, because why have things not been able to get back to perfection through evolution, right? So there's this almost Christian idea of original sin in everything that permeates all politics, all history, all philosophy. We'll never be able to get things to a perfect state. And so, someone like the Condor, who isn't actually that bad, all things considered, is really the best you can hope for. I mean, there are plenty of places in the world right now that would just, Eumeswil looks like heaven compared to.
Yeah, what you said, Christian, was basically what I would say I agree with, because that's what I kind of meant. How if you don't have a chessboard, right, then you can't really move your chess pieces, and you kind of need its opposite to be aware and express what you have. So if if you didn't have war, then you wouldn't know what peace is, all that jazz. Now, with that being said, we did go over how he needs that authority to kind of strive in and be who he is. But then we also said that if the authority is to impose it upon him, that he would much rather be a criminal. And that's very interesting, because at least in the first chapter. In the second chapter, it gets kind of more, he kind of hints at it more. But in the first chapter, he talks all about himself. He talks about who he is and how he's related to the state, who he is and how he's related to his mentors, who he is and how he's related to his family, etc. He doesn't really talk about other people. In the second chapter, he kind of does, but in this one, he doesn't. And I really wonder if, just how much the crime rate is up there. Because we know that, because we kind of get the idea that there are anarchists. That's how he knows that if he were an anarchist, he would have been caught, which implies that there are so many anarchists out there that gets caught. But what about the criminals? What about Martin's second alternative, which is, just being outside the law but then still in society? I really wonder about that, if you guys know the answer.
Well, it's kind of mentioned in this chapter, at least where I read to, that they sort of, there is quite a high crime rate in Eumeswil. It sort of says that Eumeswil, doesn't lack for dives, and there's I can't remember the name of it, but there's some sort of tavern by the docks where not a night goes by without a stabbing, it says. And then, of course, there's a passage towards the end where it sort of talks about someone who crosses this criminal, and he's trying to get on a ship, and someone nearly drops a box on him, clearly an assassination attempt, and he has a heart attack on the boat. And the doctor finds him, and the doctor examines him, and then comes back. He finds a knife in the side.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's very clear this is not a nice place, but it's also a functional place. A lot of this crime is essentially tolerated because it's sort of it's sort of controlled in a way. It's never allowed to get. There's spies everywhere. The Domo, essentially the chief of police here, he watches it all. He's got spies. He reports directly to the Condor. So it's very much like a lot of America, right? Where it's just sort of accepted that, okay, there's a mass shooting here or whatever. But things are never allowed to get too much out of control. If anything gets bad, the FBI, jump in there and take out the head guys, and sort of it all breaks up. But a certain amount of chaos is sort of tolerated. It's just part of power. It's part of reality. Again, Emmanuel, he doesn't judge this. He doesn't say this is terrible, we need to burn this city to the ground. He's just like, that's the reality of cities, and it probably truly is. Certainly ones that are sort of in decay, the way Eumeswil is. But I have a question that I want to ask about the Anarch here real quick, because Jünger sort of brought this concept of the Anarch up in a couple different books as well. I don't think it's a perfect idea, because there is a question that needs to be asked, and that's that would he still be an Anarch if there was something, if he lived in because he's so clearly a lover of history, and he clearly has parts of history that he values. One has to ask, would he be an Anarch if he was, in like 17th century France, or in, Rome at its peak, or Athens at its peak? Would he... What I'm basically asking is he only an Anarch because Eumeswil is devoid of ideas and people worth following, or is the Anarch something eternal that he would be regardless of where he is?
I love that question for two reasons, actually. One, because that's a great question in and of itself, but two, I think this is a great segue to our second topic, which was history. But we'll go over the question. I mean, he did kind of say that, to paraphrase it, because I can't quote it directly, but it's not that I don't believe in anything, it's that I demand something to believe in. And your question is basically, if he did have something to believe in, would he still be an Anarch? Correct?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Yeah, and we kind of have to take into account that it's not just Manuel that's saying these things, it's Manuel with the context of what Jünger had to go through, right? If Manuel asked Jünger from World War One, or before that, right, or even a few years after that, he would, like I said, they would be complete opposites, and in terms of relationship to being an Anarch. So I don't know what the answer is, of course, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did. And I think, you know what, actually, I think it's the fact that he did he did negate the concept of being an Anarch, not consciously, because he didn't even think of it, but because he did go against being an Anarch so many times, and I think it's the result of what happened from there that he decided to be an Anarch, if that makes sense. He only became an Anarch because he wasn't one before, and he knew where it got him.
Mm-hmm. I think you're probably right. I think the Anarch doesn't make sense in all times and places. I think there is time when you sort of have to believe, and it's worthy to believe in something, and I think you should probably do that. Now, it is very complex because there's also the idea we were talking about of the Anarch as this kind of sovereign unto himself, and there's almost like this sort of bottle of infinite possibilities that can create new ideas and all this sorts of... You could read into it so deeply. I think it's a very complex idea, but I do think that the Anarch is kind of like a little bit like being a Stoic, right? I mean, Marcus Aurelius writes his book on Stoicism, why he's campaigning. Now, was Marcus Aurelius a Stoic when he's back in Rome? Maybe not as much as he was when he's out, on the Danube campaigning against barbarians. Where you got to be tough, you got to be strong, you got to be focused. But it's complex. I'm not certain. I think that because it's interesting, because Manuel is only in his late 20s, and Jünger's writing this book in his 80s. So this is essentially a very, very grizzled old man who's been through so much. He's been through Imperial Germany, World War I Germany, Weimar Germany, Nazi Germany, communist capitalist Germany. He's seen a lot, and he's sort of, filtering it through this much younger character. So it's hard to say. Very complex. I'm not sure.
What I'll say is this: if he decides that he is never going to be anything other than an Anarch, so if he says that no matter how good the society is, I'm still going to be an Anarch, that kind of defeats the purpose of being an anarch. Because what that means is you're treating the concept of being an anarch as if it's an ideology, as if it's something that you can't adjust from. The whole point of being an anarch is that you can, like, noodle your way through different societal contexts, that you can adapt to different societal contexts. And the thing about, to oversimplify ideologies, a lot of them are not very flexible. They're very rigid in their doctrines. That's what makes an ideological person so, rigid in their ways. And I think if Martin or Manuel vowed to always be an anarch no matter what, that kind of defeats the purpose of being an anarch.
Yeah, I think you're actually spot on with that. I never thought of that. Yeah, by sort of wedding yourself to the idea of the anarch too much, you essentially defeat the purpose of it, which is kind of what the critique. A lot of the anarch comes from, and I've never read this thinker, but Max Stirner is sort of he was a
yes, the egoist, the one who calls everything a spook.
Yeah, yeah. Now I've never actually read him. I keep meaning to, because Jünger did base a lot of the anarch on him, or on his ideas anyway. But from what I understand, Marx, of all people, actually made a critique of Stirner along some of the line you said there, where by focusing so much on the ego, you essentially defeated the purpose of never having an ego. But yeah, I think that's a good critique to bring against the anarch, and I do think that to a certain extent the anarch is something that you sort of need to employ. I mean, it works very well in Eumeswil, but just like we were talking about being a mercenary, you can't always be a mercenary, right? Sometimes sometimes that just isn't possible, or not right even. Sometimes it's better just to join an army.
I am not entirely sure if I entirely agree with that assessment. Mostly because I believe that, as we previously discussed, that the anarch was like loyalty to oneself, right? So, I mean, if you commit yourself, per se, too much to be a mercenary, then that idea, it becomes higher than yourself. So I can agree with that context. If someone puts a title, it's like, I am an anarch person, right? A person who believes in the idea of being the anarch, then I can agree with that. It defeats the purpose of it, but at the same time, I think it's more of a concept than it is an ideology. So, per se, the anarch basically is basically a state of mind. So he just put words to it, and if you let the words dictate what your state of mind is, I think that would defeat the purpose, but not vice versa.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I do think, yeah, I think you're right that, yeah, if you sort of write it down as a text, right, if you tried to make like a book of anarch, you can't put ism there, but just call it anarch. But then, yeah, you would essentially defeat the purpose. But yeah, I get what you're saying, that you can't exactly be too sovereign to yourself now, can you?
Yeah,
Definitely.
I mean, I guess a great example is if you're, let's say you don't care about other people, or you don't care what they think about you, but then you become very attached to the idea that you don't care about what other people think of you. And in this sense, you kind of do care about what other people think of you, because now you have to make sure to let them know that you don't care what other people think of you. And the reason why I draw a similarity is because if you want to solidify what the anarch is, if you want to say it's XYZ and identify as, yes, I am the anarch, then it kind of puts some rigidity into who you are, right? If you say, oh, I don't care about what people think of me, well, then it kind of puts some rigidity in who you are. Then you have to make sure that you really don't care about what other people think of you, which kind of makes you care your relationship to other people. And in that regard, it's, you can't, like, it's almost very it's almost very possible to say that. I mean, obviously, Manuel's not a real person, but Manuel's not a real person even in the sense that he's not always an anarch, right? I'm pretty sure outside of the text in his day-to-day life, there are instances when he has to just go outside of what it means to be an anarch. And I say that because if he were to stick to the definitions, then he would be just as being anti-anarchic as he would have being anti-anarchic purposely. Kind of makes sense? If he deliberately tries to become an anarch forever, then that defeats the purpose. But if he also tries to not be one, then that obviously defeats the purpose as well. And in that sense, you could almost say that the anarch isn't the person, but it's more of a thing that one personifies and embodies and applies. It's undefinable. It's not solid. It's something that one is and one becomes. It's something that, but it's not inherent in you, in that you're not always that anarch.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to get at here is the idea that the anarch it doesn't really take a form, right? It never takes any kind of concrete form. It is, in a sense, the possibility of forms, the possibility of forms emerging out of what one primally is, and all people have that in a sense when they're, as I said, when they're first born, before ideologies and all other things are essentially placed onto them. But it's complex. It is very complex to think about. I don't think Jünger ever fully fleshed out what the anarch is, and maybe that's for the best, because it is, in a sense, as we're saying, not a form. It's not something that you can write down in a text. In this text, he's essentially using it as a political tool, something that can be used when you're in these kind of societies. But it's possible it goes deeper than that.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think we're all on the same page. We're just using different words to define the same thing. So really, I think it's just all we have to debate left on the anarch is just semantics.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be coming up more in the text anyway too. So I think there's some more in-depth things about it. So we'll definitely be talking about this again anyway.
With that being said, do you think I'm thinking it's a good idea to move into history, unless you have anything else to say about the anarch.
No, I think we gave a good rundown of what it is for the audience.
We'll definitely have more. We'll definitely have a new batch of material to talk about in the next chapter, especially because it's about it's the next chapter is more focused on how he directly deals with the state. But anyways, on history, the thing about this book is the scenes are interspersed throughout the story. So you can't really say, oh, this scene is talking about this particular theme, right? This part of the story is talking about this particular idea. It's kind of interspersed here and there throughout. So even in the, let's see, first, well, when does he mention that he is a historian? Yes, so much for my name and its variants. I also have to go into detail about my profession. That is, what should we call it? Section 3 of the first chapter. And right off the bat, he talks about how he's different from his father and brother. And he starts talking about many of the ills of the history department where he works at. For starters, he talks about what was that? I'm not German, so how do you pronounce the guy with the K?
Kessmüller?
Yeah, Kessmüller. And he compares. He really describes Kessmüller briefly, and then compares him to himself. So he talks about how Kessmüller, or whatever, he can reinterpret history and depending on which way the wind is blowing. And that kind of ties into what he said on the previous page about how after every overthrow, which is after the overthrow of every government, world history is to be rewritten for the sake of the moment. And so he's pointing out how everything that happened in the past is going to be reconceptualized for the sake of the present context. You get what I mean? So we can, I mean, just to give an example, right? If I do something right now, and I remember that I did something relevant yesterday, then I can raise that up on a pedestal and say, see, that's the good thing to do. We have to be more like that, etc. And then the next person comes and he overthrows me, and then he has to say, whatever happened yesterday is the best thing, etc., etc., so on and so forth. So history kind of becomes, the history itself doesn't become altered, but the way it's presented becomes so. And it's very strange that I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm getting the impression that he talks about Kessmuller in a very negative light. But it's very strange because he's not that far off from how the Anarch kind of, as you said, is a mercenary and switches from tyrant to tyrant, never being loyal to one of them. So what do you make of that?
That's very interesting. Yeah, the way this book deals with history is probably one of its strongest elements. Like, this book is absolutely swimming in history. It's almost a historical book in itself. There's so much truth in it. Like, this isn't, even though Eumeswil is fictional, this is so much of the actual historical moments are all true. You got to look them up, but I think this is Jünger. Jünger read like a book a day. Incredible reader, and there's just so much history in this, and the way he weaves it together with so many other elements, with politics, with magic, with mysticism, mythology. There's almost an entirely new discipline here. But to your point about the Anarch and Kessmuller, I'm not certain. To a certain extent, I think the Anarch, certainly in the form of Manuel, does value truth. I don't think Kessmuller values truth at all. I think he just likes to be popular. I think that he says he ingratiates power. He sucks up to power. I don't think Manuel sucks up to power. He just tolerates it. He doesn't, fawn over the condor. He doesn't, or the tribunes. He gives him a smile, and he may even like him. But there's a big difference there. He's kind of more like a cat, while Kessmuller is more like a dog. He just sort of slobbers all over him, while Jünger or Manuel, same person really, sort of moves around in the background. He can respect, but he doesn't, fawn. And I think there's a qualitative difference there that's extremely important. Plus, someone like Kessmuller, I don't think he gives a damn about finding real truth, right? I mean, I believe Kessmuller is mentioned as mocking Bruno. Is he the one that mocks? Vigo.
Yeah, he mocks the other history teacher, which is Vigo. Yeah.
Yeah, he's very dismissive of him, and I think that's the key point, because Vigo is a genius in many ways, right? He's able to just weave all these incredible new theories. He's what a scholar should be, right? I mean, Jünger is very, very down on scholarship. I think he even says here, what does genius have to do with scholarship? Nothing. And he's very down on the concept of these people. And Kessmuller is very much one of these people, right? It's all claptrap. It's all stuff we've heard before. It's all just constructed essentially to make him sound smart, to be popular, and to ingratiate who's ever in power. While someone like Vigo is genuinely challenging, genuinely interesting. He's able to open up the world in entirely new ways, open doors. And I think that, now this isn't something that the Anarch has to do, but we only have one Anarch, and that's Jünger, so we'll have to just go on that. And he clearly cares about finding truths beyond just, factual dates, right? He's trying to weave all of history and everything together to form these human truths, these bigger truths, meta truths, I guess you could call it.
Well, okay, so I guess that answers mine, but then it makes me ask another. So it answers mine insofar as, okay, so on the surface level, you could say that Kismuter and the Anarch is similar in that they're both wishy-washy, but then their differences lies in why they're doing it and for what purpose they're doing it, which is, why they're doing it. So you could almost say that they're almost doing the same thing, but what they're doing it for is different. And as you said, the other difference is that Vigo, into, I guess you could say to a lesser extent, but especially Vigo is pronounced here, he's very caring about the truth. So that kind of answers my question, and I could definitely see their difference. But then what that makes me wonder is, if you care about something like the truth, and if you care about preserving it, or if you care about reaching it, if you care about teaching it, that doesn't that kind of risk you not becoming an anarch, insofar as you have to make the necessary prerequisites to make sure that the truth is found, and that you have to have certain fundamental rules to make sure that the truth is found. And we see that even Martin himself, he's like, I trust facts, not whatever. He's very facts oriented. He's very objectively oriented, etc., etc. But then if you put if you raise the search for truth so high, wouldn't that? Oh man, how do I word it?
I think I get what you're trying to say.
It would limit yourself. Yeah, it would limit yourself such that you would have to sacrifice your self-autonomy. There you go.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yes, but I don't think the Anarch is the end goal in a sense, right? I think it's sort of a, as we were kind of talking about earlier, it's kind of a way to live, right? It's sort of a way to let you live authentically and to sort of keep that sovereignty over yourself. But you can't just sort of retreat into a bubble and just sort of do nothing, right? I mean, maybe you can, but I don't think that's enough, right? I think clearly there's other things that you should be striving for, and Emmanuel is a historian, right? And he sort of uses the Anarch as a way to survive in this city and to sort of maintain himself in this world of power, right? He's at the Cash Bar. He's a bartender there. He's with some of the most powerful people in Eumeswil. In fact, the Yellow Khan visits. We've sort of only had him mentioned, but he's essentially like one of the rulers of the world. It seems to be. He's a very scary man, but because Manuel is this Anarch, he's able to interact with him because he's not threatening to him. He's not challenging him for power. He's not even really particularly afraid of him, because what reason does the Khan have to fear him? He's not an anarchist. He doesn't believe in anything. He's not even in history, in a sense. It gives him an objectivity about the world, which serves his desire for truth and for history. So in a way, yes, we're saying that we're back to the Anarch, but I think we're saying that the Anarch isn't the end goal. It's sort of a means to other things, which is interesting in itself, because I guess that goes back to the Anarch not being an ideology, right? You don't pursue it for its own goal. It's a way of living that allows you to pursue other things, hopefully better things. And I don't think that someone like Kismuller, going back to him, has that, right? The Anarch is the monarch of himself, right? While someone like Kismuller is the jester, right?
Yeah,
both in court. But
the Anarch kind of defines himself. And that's not too far from the topic of history, as you might think, James, because even in the final pages of the chapter, right? Jünger has this thing where he talks about history and linguistics in one page, and then history and linguistics on another, and it's very spread apart, so it's kind of hard to organize, but he kind of uses Alexander the Great's empire as an example, and how that relates to character. So we talk about how Kismuller doesn't have a character because he's too attached to impressing the ruler at the time. Well, Jünger raises the point of Alexander the Great's empire, where When the empire falls apart, as after Alexander's death, the old tribes try to isolate themselves again, each citing its own distinctive character. But this is precisely what they have lost by passing through the empire like grain around the mill. So he's basically talking about how history kind of smoothens the definitions of a person, and it kind of makes you of that historical era, right? It makes you of that historical empire, of that historical event, and how that kind of takes away your character and identity, and you're kind of letting history define you. And I think that's partly why Jünger is very adamant about talking about history, because you could almost say that history is full of people who have sacrificed their identity to something external. And so maybe it's not such a bad idea that we're talking about Anarch and the history at the same time.
No, I think you're right, actually, yeah. Now you mention it, yeah, I think that the anarch is essentially a historical figure in a sense. You have to have, I think, an understanding of history to be an anarch. You could say that an anarchist, I think he actually does say in this book somewhere that an anarch is just an anarchist who understands history.
Yeah, I have to add that I think, as we previously described, that the rules that have to come with interpreting history, I think that actually encourages the development of the I guess state of mind of the anarch, in that when you define like historical events by like pure facts, and you don't define it by per se your own personal biases and interpretations, or what your ruler would have you interpret the age as. I think that really allows one to, I guess, become the anarch, because they, in a way, how do I phrase this? It just allows you to formulate, I guess, your own philosophy, and that's not really attached to any ideology.
Mm-hmm. I just really want to go back to something that you said, Kohei, where you talked about sort of going through the grinding mill of empires, right? I think it's very interesting. Just I want to just quickly, while we're talking about history, I want to sort of put Eumeswil in history because it's a very historical place. I think the name was actually taken from one of Alexander's generals. So the Diocletian period is. Mm-hmm. So that period is obviously very important. And it's interesting because Eumeswil itself is clearly a very historical city, but it's also sort of used up its energy, right? It's a city that's sort of it clearly was part of the world that was, I think it's implied that the world was united in a world state at one point, and then that sort of broke apart. And it's interesting, they sort of mention that they don't even know geographically where Eumeswil is. Manuel says that sometimes he thinks the sea to the north is the Mediterranean, sometimes he thinks it's the Atlantic, so they don't even know where they are geographically, which sort of adds to the sort of wondrous mystery of this sort of world. They talk about the great forest, this gigantic forest where strange beasts come in, so it's something very strange has happened to the world, sort of has returned it to a magical, mystical place, but Eumeswil itself remains exhausted, and it is very interesting that it's clearly gone through this imperial period that has sort of just drained it of all energy, right? It's all its ideas are used up. It's almost this very Spenglerian idea where a sort of an empire has sort of gone through its natural phase, and now it's just sort of fading out. Fossilized, I think, is the word that Emmanuel uses. So history is very much alive. Things sort of wash up in the shore, but it almost doesn't penetrate into... I'll take that back, actually. History isn't alive, but it's present, but it's not alive, right? It's fossilized. You can study it, but you can't live it.
Yeah. What you actually just said about history, we were going over how Eumswil and Manuel were talking about history in a very meta sense. And speaking of, this whole meta history and, part of an empire or a state or a government being, present or not, I want to allude to another book that really talks about, history from a meta perspective, and that is Fate of Empires, if you know what that is, where there's this guy named John Glubb, I believe. I actually did a video on him on my channel. It's one of my first videos, so I can't promise the quality of it. But he basically broke down that after studying, history, after studying the Fate of Empires for the last, I don't know, but like from the time of Persia, so empires before the time of Christ. He said that empires not only have an average lifespan of 250 years, but they also go through 6 stages where first comes the stage of pioneers, and then they go through the conquest and the commerce and the affluence and the intellect. And so they go through these distinct stages, but then in the end, they go through a stage of decadence and decline, and then maybe collapse or whatever. So I guess you could very much draw parallels to the nature of Eumswil in relationship to this whole lifespan of empires. And we could definitely see how Emmanuel was living not just in a post-apocalyptic sense, but in a post-historical sense, insofar as the empire is on its decline and the state no longer has a distinct identity, as you pointed out, James. And so it's kind of up to him to make it himself. That's my take.
Yeah, I mean, something interesting that James said was that according to his interpretation, that the world was unified and then it broke apart, and I think that's basically an allusion to the Alexandrian Empire, where after he died, he didn't really have a successor, and because he didn't really have a successor, his generals took parts of the empire and broke apart and then fought wars against one another for, I think, 100 years or something like that, the Wars of the Diadochi. And I just looked it up, and Eumenes was, what's it called? He took the part, he took, I think, Asia Minor, right? And the interesting part about Eumenes is that I'm pretty sure from my memory that he fought like a number of like successful like wars against his neighbors, right? And then there was a coalition which completely wiped out his kingdom. So I think that's pretty interesting as well.
Yeah, so I guess that kind of talks about how you have, at the downfall of one empire, you have certain schisms of smaller empires that branch out in many directions. And if you're like Kismuter and you get caught up in all that, then you kind of lose yourself, right? And just like how he reinterprets his history whichever way the wind blows, his identity is redefined whichever way the wind blows. It's not really his to define. Speaking of which, though, if you guys don't mind, I want to get into the other part of history that I want to talk about, and which is more immediate, because he talks about his family history. He's very vague about his mother. He's very vague about his father. He's very vague about his brother. And he only talks about them insofar as they're not very close and to each other. And more importantly, more tellingly, he talks about how he prefers a family bond, or a bond between friends and things like that over family, over blood, right? And I want to see what your preliminary thoughts on that before we dive deep into that.
Yeah, it's very Roman, isn't it? It's very I think it's very famously what Julius Caesar did. He adopted Octavian, right? That wasn't his actual son, and no one questioned it, right? It's very very odd, especially when you consider the civil wars erupted in Rome at that time. That no one sort of actually challenged Octavian and said, yo, you're not the real son of Caesar. Everybody just kind of accepted it, even though it was just an adoption. But it seems to be harking back to that again. History's very much alive in this book, and there's a lot of references to Rome, even the sort of the tribunes, the sort of democratic leaders of Eumeswil before the Condor took over. That's a Roman term, and lots of Roman stuff here. So he seems to be harking back to that old idea of Roman patronage, where you would literally just adopt a son, and that son would be, in many sense, that son could literally be the legitimate heir to an empire. In fact, I think a lot of the best emperors actually sort of selected uh, their heir based on not necessarily their genes, but who's the best person to do it. And nobody questioned this, and it's very interesting.
Well, I mean, and he even talks about how he almost made a conscious attempt to distance himself from his parents and distance himself from his family, and he prefers, one finds spiritual foster fathers. The bonds one forms with them are stronger than those of bloods, and we can very much easily infer as to who these spiritual foster fathers are. They're obviously Vigo and Bruno, and we could obviously ask and discuss why he's like that, but I think we should also talk about the significance of that. Why is it that in this post-apocalyptic world, why is finding spiritual foster fathers more optimal than being loyal to your actual fathers? Is it because because with the way Emmanuel is operating, you can pick your fathers just how you can pick your own course of action, whereas to stay aligned with your genetic biological fathers, it's almost like a metaphor where the fathers are a stand-in for your past, and he's kind of saying you kind of have to be independent of your past, and you kind of have to pick that which guides you, if that makes sense. You can't
Yeah,
blindly stay to your paternal figures, which is not only the father but the government. So that's where I'm drawing the parallels. I don't know if that's reading too much into it, though.
it's interesting. You could read this almost in two ways. You could read it as sort of the decay in Eumeswil itself, where even the father, because there's there's a lot of points in this where you sort of get why Manuel would not want to particularly care for his father. He discovers that his father wanted to abort him. In fact, even going so far as to try and, I think, poison his wife or his girlfriend at the time. I think that's kind of hinted at. His mother protected him, though, as he describes as sheltering Zeus from Kronos. Very interesting analogy there. Again, more history mythology brought in. But it's interesting, yeah, because you can read it like that. You could read it as this is even infected Manuel, where he just is just sort of like, I don't care about my family. I'll just sort of find my own family. Very postmodern, very late modern. Or you could say that this is something deeper than that, right? This is going back to Rome, as was saying, and this is, like he describes, like a father should be this kind of natural leader. He describes fishermen working fish, and sort of the captain of that, who sort of has this natural father-like quality to his men. And you could see how a lot of people could see that in the Condor, and of course Manuel has it for Bruno and Vigo. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to read of it myself. I was born a Christian. I'm sure most of us here were, and so there's sort of a natural affinity for family and respect for the father and the mother, which sort of is being tossed aside here. I'm not sure how to feel about that. It's complex. Obviously, there's reasons for it. But but like everything in this novel, you could chew it for a very long time and not quite ever hit rock bottom.
Yeah, just when you think can, you find contradicting evidence, right? And we can, and his, that's in regards to his father, and the why I make that this the why I predicted what I inferred is because, well, symbolically speaking, the government has always been like a father figure for the citizens, and I assume that my inference was correct, partly because he talks about his mother in a very different way. His mother is much more vague, and he can't really get into it because his mother's dead. My mother died young during my early school years. Here's the important part. Here's what really caught me. I regarded the loss as a second birth, an expulsion into a brighter, colder, foreign land, this time consciously. What do you make of that?
That's another one of those ones that's just filled with so much depth. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what's being said, but it's certainly produced a character change in him. I mean, Manuel is very mature in his thought and his worldly character. So some of that could perhaps be traced back to that original loss of the mother. It sort of revealed as well what his father was a little bit. He sort of had to live with him a lot more, and he lost a certain amount of innocence at that point, I think. I'm not sure, honestly. It's such a complex thing. You'd almost have to ask someone who lost their mother. It's very difficult to say.
Honestly, I think that his, I guess, dislike for his biological father and the fact that he lost his mother so young have contributed to, I guess, his state of mind to becoming the anarch. So he only felt like, I guess, a strong biological love for his mother, and he lost her early on. And since he didn't really love his father because his father, I guess, was not very loving or kind towards him, I think that, I guess, basically started his path on becoming having the state of mind of the anarch because he no longer tied himself to sort of the neutral, or excuse me, the nuclear family. He started, I guess, at that point to identify himself more with other, I guess, like spiritual relatives, people who he clicked with or vibed with, depending on your terminology.
Yeah, um, I think, I think you're both talking about the same thing here, and just to take some Freudian pseudoscience, you could definitely see the mother as like a symbolic as innocence, as James that you pointed out. Um, where she kind of represents that state of comfort and state of reality, and when she died, so did the conceptualization, so did the way of seeing that world died with it, if that makes sense. So that's when the reality headed in and says, all right, this is how the world is, and you kind of have to be an anarch or perish. That's how I kind of take it, and from hearing what you guys said, I would assume that's how you take it as well. Although, of course, you two did point out that you can't really make any definitive answers because you're just not sure, and I have to agree with you there. I'm on the same boat on that one.
Yeah, it's very complex. It sort of weaves Junger's sort of weaving this sort of complex character in Manuel here. It's hard to say what's just an event in his past and what's maybe the author trying to say
Yeah,
about it. It could be a meta statement, right? The loss of the mother. You could say something there that's going on where the world has lost the mother, and there's just this sort of cold, calculating father who's very, he's a liberal. He's very litigious. He's very pedantic. He's not like Bruno or Vigo. He sort of lacks creativity and perhaps even kind of softness, and sort of maybe that's part of why, I don't want to psychologize, but maybe that's why Manuel's sort of attracted to these sort of more mythical elements. But again, we could be reading complex into that. It could just be an event that Jünger put in there just to say a few things.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who prefers the extraordinary and the significant, I would hope that there's some deeper meaning to it. Maybe, as he says, maybe he talks about the mythologies just to talk about it in a timeless sense, that it's beyond time, it's beyond history. But like I said, we could go on this for hours, and never really find some aha moment. This is definitely true. What is more concrete, though, I must say, what is more clear to me is his relationship to his so-called foster fathers, his mentors. And that's very telling in and of itself, that he purposely, it's almost like Jünger purposely kept his biological parents vague, and then really narrowed in and focused on his surrogate fathers. And that really, I think, to me, tells me just how important the spiritual foster fathers are in relationship to his biological fathers, insofar as one is more significant, one is more worthy of putting emphasis on. And we know that, he has two of them, Bruno and Vigo. Yes, Bruno and Vigo, and they are philosophers and historians, respectively. And James, you said something that was very interesting, and I want to hear you and what Christian has to say, that they are somehow an extension of who Manuel is. And I never really understood that. I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case, but I wouldn't really be able to argue for it. So can you kind of fill in the gap, sir? You there, James? He's dead. Oh, he's back from the grave.
I was gonna say that I'm just trying to figure out how to articulate this in my head.
Well, I mean, it's definitely not far off the charts insofar as, Manuel himself is a historian, and he's really philosophizing, and you could say Eumeswil is a philosophical book. So there you go. It's about a historian, and he's talking about his apolitical philosophy, if you will. But I just don't know why. I just don't know what to make of it, if you will. Is there any deeper meaning to the fact that the teachers are historians and philosophers? Is there any significance to the fact that the chapter is named The Teachers? And I just wanted to know what you two make of that.
I hypothesize that the fact that he holds his teachers in such high esteem, and his genetic father to such a low esteem, I believe he ends the book on that note, which is fairly interesting. I think that just alludes back to the idea of the anarch, and that he's not an anarchist, and that he does like and need authority. I believe he references that multiple times. But at the same time, he needs autonomy in his own thinking. So he's not necessarily bound by his biological father through, I guess, causes that were not, up to his choice. But he did choose his adoptive fathers, respectively. So I guess that just alludes back to the idea that the father figure, I guess, is sort of an authority figure, and he needs that but at the same time, he likes to be in that.
Yeah, he needs a legitimate one.
He needs, yeah, a father of his choosing, a mentor, I guess, and that's what a father figure is.
Just looking over through my notes here, I gotta say I agree with you, but I think there's more to it. And this more to it kind of goes against what James says, where I don't think Bruno and Vigo are an extension of him. I think they're a personification of what they teach, so history and philosophy. So when he says, "Oh, I am more attached to these two people than my biological parents," he's basically saying, "I am more loyal to history and philosophy, in that it's more important to me rather than the liberal mindset of his biological father." If that makes sense. So he's basically saying, uh, that it kind of ties into his loyalty to facts and objective truths, in and that requires that one raise the esteem, regards history and philosophy with high esteem, and that negates the emphasis on his biological parents. Do you kind of get my drift here? Where the Vigo and Bruno are not an extension of the protagonist, but they're a personification of the subject that they teach, and the protagonist is then learning from that.
I guess you can interpret it that way. I was thinking from a psychological perspective, where he chose his adopted, I guess, father figures, to where his adopted father figures were basically what he was interested in and what he wanted to learn, who he wanted to be as he grows up, or at least when he gets older.
Okay. So you kind of see it as a, oh, I kind of, yeah. So you kind of see, you're saying that the protagonist sees his biological fathers as remnants of a dead past, and he is saying that Bruno and Vigo is more of a compass that's guiding them towards the future, if you will. And he's saying that that's where I want to go, not to the outdated past, but to those to the future, which is personified by Vigo and Bruno. Is that more in line with what you're saying?
Roughly, what I'm trying to say is that I guess he just has I'm not sure if you've heard of the term daemon, but it's Greek for spirit, right? And it's this philosophical concept that you have sort of like a purpose ingrained into your soul, right? And you have to follow that purpose because it's instinct, right? And I think that I guess Bruno and Vigo, they kind of like assist Emmanuel or Martin in his path towards becoming, or I guess realizing his daemon's wishes, which are, I guess, to become like a really great historian and a very intelligent philosopher.
I see. You mentioned pronounce it again, daemon.
Yeah, daemon.
Yeah, I know that we're from eudaimon, and yeah, so he's basically, I guess it's affirmation that he's kind of picking his own purpose here. He's kind of picking his own direction, if that makes sense. Are we is that where we're on the same page?
Yeah, that's pretty much what I'm saying.
All right, cool. James, you back? You
Oh yeah, I'm here. Yep.
whew. Were you
Problems with my.
Yeah, were you able to catch all that we were saying?
Yep, pretty much.
All right. Anything to add? Because I'm thinking we move on to the linguistics so that we can talk about what you suggested on Eumswil as a whole.
I think we can move on. I think that was pretty good.
All right, cool. So, language, language, I would say is talked briefly in the first part of the chapter, and then extensively on the final parts of the first chapter. And in both cases, it's very vague. It's not very direct. It's not directly arguing what. It's not directly pointing out what Jünger wants to say here. So we'll start with the easy one, I guess. Easy in so far as it's mentioned briefly. So he prefaces the significance of language by saying, to make the vague more precise, to define the indefinite more and more sharply, that is the task of every development, every temporal exertion. The same applies to handwriting. And again, I could be reading too much into this, but I guess when you think about handwriting, it could be more symbolic of expression of, some kind of means of expressing who you are, and that's what makes it more precise. That's what makes you more clear, transparent. And he goes even furthermore in the next page for me, section 2, where he talks about the oh man, I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation. Etymology, which is the roots of every word. So where the word come from. So Christian, you just mentioned daemon. So you could say, oh, daemon means this, and so the roots of eudaimon is you and daemon. Well, the same applies to Eumeswil, right? So as you pointed out, Christian, that Eumes was a general who served Alexander the Great, if I heard you correctly, and then it's combined with Ogeni, and together it makes Eumeswil. And then the most significant example in that first part of the chapter is how, and I chuckled a bit here, is how the condor insists that he calls Manuel Martin or Martin Manuel. Which was it? He calls.
You're talking about the condor?
Yeah. Does he call Manuel Martin or does he call Martin Manuel?
No, he calls him Manuel because it sounds nicer, right? It kind of flows.
Yeah.
Depending, on his mood, he does different variations, but yeah.
What do you make of that? Because
I think first of all, that's setting up that the condor is this sort of he's not a despot, right? He doesn't just sort of torture people. He rules and he's a tyrant, but he's very interested in music and things sounding nice and aesthetics. So we're sort of setting up the character a bit there, but I do think there's sort of a deeper level to it where the importance of a name, right, and the importance of, it's brought up a few times, right? His second name as well is Venator, which I think means hunter. I think it's Latin for hunter, and so there's all these very strange plays with words going on. He's not really a hunter. In fact, he's sort of a pacifist. He kind of says, but in a strange way, he kind of is a hunter. He's sort of hunting through history for truths, and there's all these kind of strange things. And then I just love the way the condor plays with his name, right? Constantly just making it sound nice. He just changes it in a strange way. There's sort of, you could say, the past is kind of being rewritten in a little bit there to sort of make it something smoother, a little more beautiful, or you could say that it's being rewritten by power. So lots of strange things there just in the first 2 paragraphs, right, dealing with his name. But yeah.
I find it interesting that and that I think based off of the way that Martin or Manuel describes the way that the condor uses the term Manuel, it seems more as a term of endearment. I mean, you don't, at least from my memory, doesn't seem like he gives anyone else any nicknames. And
Oh no,
I
no,
don't think.
he does, he does. He
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but go on with your point. I still want to hear it out.
Um, let me think here. Um, so based on, well, he still gives variations on the name depending on his mood, and he also, I believe, after Manuel or Martin is done with his work, he gets, I guess, a pleasant farewell from the Condor, and I'm not sure if that's setting them up for a friendship or not, but it seems like the Condor has, I guess, goodwill towards Martin or Manuel.
Yeah, I always get that feeling too.
Well, what's interesting is he's so Manuel or Martin. What's so interesting about Manuel Martin is that he's very particular about choosing his own identity. You know, not never having allegiance to another state or whatever. But he really doesn't care about his name, what people call him. Does that do you see that as a contradiction, or do you see that as a statement that his name is not really part of his identity?
To a certain extent, yeah, I think I agree with that. He's sort of, again, he's sort of spiritually adopted this, both this identity of the Anarch and his followers in Vigo and Bruno, and to a certain extent, perhaps even in the Condor, uh, and the figures around him, right, the Domo and Attila. But it's yeah, I think you're right. I think that Martin Venator is very much something that doesn't really exist anymore. I think that Emmanuel is now, you could call him Emmanuel Anarch, is very much the sort of the reality there. There's sort of this book plays a lot with the idea of mirrors, which is something that I'm not certain what's going on there, but mirrors are brought up constantly, and there's sort of this idea of the mirror image. So, you know, which one is sort of the real Martin, right? Is it the sort of this image that he presents at the bar, this sort of well dressed, Martin? Is it the image he presents at the Luminar at the university, where he's this historical figure, or is it the Anarch? And as the book goes on, we'll see sort of more aspects of this character. He's sort of well, we won't spoil that, but yeah, there's something deeper going on here with identities that it's almost fractured, like a fractured mirror. And Eumeswil itself is, I think, described as being fractured, and of course the world at this point is fractured into small city states and certain empires, and ideas are fractured. So there's definitely something going on at a very deep level with some of these ideas.
Yeah, I have to agree. And oh shoot, when I was gonna I forgot what I was gonna say. Excuse me.
That's all right. Just sticking on the topic of language, I think that this ties into something we were talking about earlier on with the idea of exhaustion, spiritual exhaustion. And the first time I read this book, that was sort of the thing that really hit me, was this sort of idea of language no longer having any power, right? It's basically lost any kind of ability to sort of say deep things. I think it's sort of described as being unable to, it doesn't work for prayers anymore. Poetry can't be written. Words essentially have been replaced by numbers, I think it says. I think by that he means that there's just become this sort of very words mean basically only what they on the surface seem to mean, right? You say hello, you mean hello. There's no sort of deep meaning behind words anymore. There's a malaise that is sort of soaked into the entire culture of Eumeswil, and it's soaked into the language too. And now it's almost impossible. There's actually a very long passage of the book, sort of between, I think it's Kissmuller and Vigo, where they sort of talk about this, right? Where Vigo uses the term moons to describe months, and everybody sort of laughs at him, ha ha ha, you're using this silly phrase. But, and to a certain extent, it is a silly phrase. Like if anybody used moon, many moons ago, you'd sound a bit foolish. But in a sense, it's actually a much more accurate and much more beautiful way of saying it. But because of this malaise, it's soaked into everything. It's soaked into language, that it's very difficult to use these expressive and complex terms, right? You have to use something very, very scientific, months. You can't really say moons.
Yeah, I mean, just think about our own life, right? Our communication is very autopilot and systemized. You talk about, you meet a new person, and you meet someone, and it's always the standardized, what's your name? How are you? What do you do for work? And
Yeah.
half the times you don't even care. That's just the routine that you go through when you meet someone. And in that sense, I have to say, they have sense but not meaning. And Jünger writes in section 13, words have meaning still but not sense. But I mean, I would point out that if I could be so daring, that when you go on these autopiloted response, when you go on these autopiloted conversations, they make sense, but they have no meaning. They have no weight to them anymore. And it's I mean, I don't want to be like, oh, we live in a society kind of mood, but there's definitely some kind of phenomenon where there's nothing alive to every word that we use. There's nothing behind the word anymore that we speak of. It's like I said, there is a malaise to it.
It's very difficult to produce genuine works of art using language because the words essentially have lost any kind of multi-layered aspect to them. They just mean exactly what they seem to mean on the surface. And this obviously then seeps into everything, right? It seeps into politics, where eventually any kind of grand political idea breaks down because all these words, I mean, you hear it all the time, right? I mean, how many times a day do we hear democracy and liberty and freedom? And these words are just so worn out. They're like jeans that have been put in a wash a million times. They've lost all color. They're horrible to wear. It's just the entire culture has become fossilized. It lacks life, and it's almost impossible at this point to sort of breathe life into it, right? You just sort of have to, again, this is why we get to the Anarch, right? You sort of have to just stop playing these games and just sort of, find what little things you can that can amuse you or can give you higher meaning and sort of try and survive in it. Because it's just, you shouldn't play these silly games of, like if someone jumped out into the street and started saying, the condor is a tyrant, blah, 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 let's overthrow him, freedom, it would just ring completely hollow. I think Manuel even says, the city would have to run out of bread and wine before anybody would give a shit, because these things have just lost all possible meaning.
I mean, yeah, again, I don't want to be too edgy, but it is a bit sad that, we have these, what's the word? I mean, I don't want to, not catchphrase, but, words that we use, but they don't have any significance behind them. And that really is not just the decay of language, right? So he points out the decay of language is not so much a disease as a symptom. And I think it's a symptom of the decay of culture. There is no life behind these words, as he pointed out. And I think that life is made by that culture. That's my hot take on it, at least. But I mean, even today, there's a very surreal extension to this too, because at least the words we use, even if they don't have meaning, they have its roots in things that were meaningful, correct? So, like as you said, buzzwords was the things I was looking for. So we have these buzzwords like, democracy, right? And I believe it was George Carlin that says that politicians just almost out of habit, without even sincerely saying so, they just at the end of every speech they just say, "God bless you," and "God bless America," "God bless you as well," "God bless yada yada," but there's no meaning behind it. But at the very least, these words had its roots in meaningful language, right? So democracy had its roots in oh man, my memory fails me right now. But demo,
Athens.
no, like the word, like
Oh, the demos. Oh, right.
like eudaimonia was you and daemon. Democracy was demo and krat, I believe. Oof, I'm not too sure, but you get my point. They're rooted in words that actually other words that actually have meaning. But then words these days, or especially the slang, some of them has its roots in other words, like okay boomer, right? That's from the baby boomer. But what about like words like based? Like it's what is the word based upon? There's no root of that. Do you know what I mean? And that just further empties the meaning behind the words. And once you are able to control the meaning, once you're able to erase the meaning behind the words, then it becomes a lot easier to control it, because then you could just add in what the meaning means, right? And this happens to words all the time. That's how language kind of works. So you could say that the word gay, for example, used to be very not just happy, but like very jolly, upbeat kind of thing. And then now it's the more not technical, colloquial, common word for homosexual. And so words change meaning, but there's a real significance to how words change meaning, because if you're able to control the meaning behind the words, they don't even have to control what words you use, but they just have to control the meaning behind the words. Then what that means is you can basically control how people would process the reality around them, because to process reality you have to put it into language almost. And this is partly why illiterate people, they dream more vividly. They dream in sensations, whereas people who can read and write, their dreams are more based in language, and because that's how we process it. And so if you change the meaning of how we process it, then you change how we conceptualize the world, right? So how you process things, be it the past, locations, events, they can be controlled if you control the language used, or the meaning behind the languages. And so what that means is the powers that be can manipulate the wisdom of Vigo and Bruno, which is exactly what Kesmuner is saying, as you guys pointed out. And that's something that I'm very, passionate about, because, if your reality can be controlled by other people, then, that goes back into the whole mirror kind of thing. Which one is the real manual? Which one's the real protagonist? Which one's the real you? And that all starts with the name. And that's why I brought up the name topic, because, is it really that small of a deal? I'm pretty sure, the significance as a name has much more to it, because that's the title that you go by. And if they can control that, then they can control you. And, this is my last point. Manu is all about, hiding his freedom, not letting it be known so that he could always keep it. He's never fully loyal to one side or another. But there comes a point where even Manu himself can forget which side, which is the real truth. If he keeps hiding it from others, there comes the risk where he kind of hides it from himself too, unwillingly. And that's what Dostoevsky really pointed out in the opening pages of the Brothers Karamazov, in which if you I'm paraphrasing, but if you keep lying, there comes a point where you believe your own lies and you don't even know the truth anymore. And that all starts with controlling the meaning behind the language that we use. A bit of a ramble, but hopefully there's a lot to take from it to have some ample discussion.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point. Those are massive points. I won't try to add on because it's quite a lot people to digest there, but I just want to sort of take in a slightly different direction. That when Jünger's sort of talking here about language, I'm definitely sure there's definitely a lot of what you were saying there, where it's control and the shifting of the meaning. But I sort of took it in a little more like almost a spiritual sense, where these words are given power essentially by a metaphysical reality beyond it, right? So we talked about the idea of God, right? The idea of God, the word gains its power essentially by the belief in God, and if that disappears, then essentially that word just becomes, you could change it. It can mean sausages or something, right? It can mean whatever you want, but because the concept behind it is sort of faded out, and a lot of these other words, honor, truth, a lot of these things are sort of just, there's supposed to be a thing behind it. It's not just this sort of word. It's not like chair or something, right? It's supposed to be something that captures something beyond reality, that infuses all reality with its element, truth, beauty, whatever. And what Junger's trying to say, that as Eumeswil itself is kind of faded out, and of course we can draw parallels of our own world here, especially the 20th century liberal societies that have sort of lost this, right? All of these words are just sort of in play now. They mean very little. This is why conversations can be quite boring, right? Where you could really stop a conversation by bringing up the concept of God, right? Everybody would sort of be like, hold their breath a little bit. Something big has been mentioned, but now it's just like, yeah, whatever. You could have mentioned a TV show. It doesn't really matter. And that sort of infects everything further down and robs everything of any kind of meaning, right? And Jünger makes an interesting point, because he says that the people who do this, right? Let's be honest, what we're talking about radical leftists here and postmoderns. I mean, I like some postmoderns, but you know what I'm saying. And when they sort of rob these words, like honor, tradition, truth, God, of meaning, they are, in a sense, he says, why should we take their words seriously then, right? Why should we take words like liberty or equality or racism or any of these things seriously if you're destroying all other words, right? Why? These all fall together, and eventually what you're going to be left with is just a grey nothing, in which all values will eventually fall with that, including ones that you like. So it's like a domino effect. So I think in the sense that I'm reading it, there's sort of a spiritual, metaphysical, mystical sort of backing to a lot of these words and concepts that's been lost, that's sort of drained them of any kind of power. And that loss is being felt very much in Eumeswil, right? Where, again, you get just a lot of people like Kessmiller talking claptrap. They can say whatever they want. And, as long as it sounds nice or pleases power, then people will clap.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I'm not too familiar with the postmodernists, but as far as I understand, they deconstruct, or they kind of deconstruct the significance of what we have to very simplify it. Am I correct? Or do they try to impose their own meaning?
It depends. A lot. They sort of began in that way. I mean, postmodernism is kind of a meme in many ways. It's debatable whether it even exists, but there definitely were thinkers like Deleuze and especially Derrida with regards to language, who sort of try to argue that words essentially they're always in free play and they have no sort of meaning behind them, right? God is just a concept, just this, there's nothing behind this word, and it only makes sense in relation to other words, and there's truth in there, but at the same time, the process of it very much robs these things of their usefulness and what was trying to be got at with that word, right?
Okay, well, I ask because if it's really just about taking away the meanings, then in that sense they're very then that in that sense the postmodernists are to linguistics what the anarchist is to political institutions.
Yeah. I mean, many of them were anarchists and radical Marxists in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and you really have to draw a fine line here, and because you can take away a meaning, you can take away the state, you can take away a phenomenon, but then you're left with nothing. So, and then Jünger is like, well, no, we kind of need to have that something to kind of make our way through it. We kind of need the marble stone to kind of make the sculpture. But just to play devil's advocate, though, What if you could take away the meaning of something and then insert your own meaning into it? What if you have not just the power of eliminating the state, but then adding your own? Now, Jünger, I think, mentioned in regards to the state, he mentioned how, well, if you do this, then now you're kind of controlled by the people that you have to rule. But then you could kind of say the same thing with the linguistics, where if you kind of impose your own meaning, then you're kind of controlled by the meaning that you impose. Because you kind of have to make it mean that, you have to ensure that the word means the way that you have imposed it. So, and then we get very muddy though, because then, well, if you're not going to impose your own language, then sure, you're not going to be controlled by the language that you prescribe, but then you're still kind of risk being controlled by the language that other people use. And you could say, well, sure, but as an anarch, I'm not very controlled. I don't live what does he say? I live in society, but I don't live of it. Well, I function. I don't function with language, but I function of it. Something along that lines. But it's very hard to live independent of language as one would live independent of the state, because everybody uses language much more than they are connected. Everyone's connected to their language more than they are connected to the state, because a language is, you can't really say it's a social construct. It's communication is something embedded in us. It's natural, right? Even if we didn't have words, we would still be communicating. But rather, the state is a social construct, right? So it's very hard to be an anarch in terms of language. And I really want to hear what an anarch would do in that scenario. Because sure, the meaning of words is gone, but with whatever meaning it has, you're still going to be controlled by it.
Well, I think that the anarch, don't forget, isn't an anarchist, right? He doesn't want to destroy the state. He doesn't want to destroy language. He does actually live within the state, right? I mean, he works for the condor. He obeys the condor's orders, and so in the same sense, I think that's true of language, right? I mean, he obeys the rules of language. He uses it, but just like with the condor, right? He doesn't fully embrace it, right? He studies history. He studies power. He studies the way people operate, just as one could study language, its history, its etymology, and the mythology, and perhaps the truth that gives meaning to that. And so, in a sense, you're part of it, right? You're not an anarchist. You're not outside of it. You're not trying to destroy it. You're not totally rejecting it. You're living within it because you have to live within it, but you're finding a way to be sovereign within it, right? So, just as one studies power and history, one could study language, study its meanings. You can still use it every day, but you can understand that these meanings could be fluid, or that there's deep truths that are sort of captured behind it, that are sort of above it, and all these sorts of complex things. So I don't think it's as much of a problem as you might be thinking here.
Okay. So you're saying where it's still possible that even though they control the language that you use, it's still possible to kind of be aware of it and then kind of keep note of the deeper meaning that they're used to exist in that sense, you could kind of keep your sovereignty.
Exactly, just as he does with power, right?
Yeah.
He works with the condor. I mean, the condor could shoot him at any time, but he's smart. He knows what to do. He obeys the law. He obeys the rules, but he never gives his mind over to it, right? He is his own sovereign. And you could, in theory, you could do that with language too. And I think he does do that by studying history and the meaning of these terms and all these complex things, that he's able to keep himself free of those sort of those tides, those waves, those rivers that would pull him in different directions.
Yeah, and I guess that goes into why history is so important, because in that you know the past know the history of each language that you use, and you know the nature of the language, no matter what anybody says it is. And it's also important to get in touch with philosophy, because then you know what to make of it. You know how to logically figure out what that language is, if that makes sense.
Study the etymology of it, know where it comes from, know what the actual meanings are.
Yeah.
And that's why I said I don't hate the postmoderns entirely, because someone like Derrida, who did try to, in a sense, destroy language, but he did it, I think, with a decent enough reason. He wanted to sort of rediscover meanings that have been lost in words and try and play with them. He uses the word play a lot, where you engage in this kind of play with words and meanings and construct new ways of doing it. Unfortunately, I think his sort of more radicalism means that he wanted these words to sort of be forever in play, never really meaning anything, and that just leads to chaos. Again, anarchist versus anarch. The anarchist is Derrida, who wants to destroy all meaning in language and have it constantly in a state of flow, but the anarch sort of recognizes that, to a certain extent, this flow, it can't be forever in flux. There's deeper things underneath it that sort of power these things, and you sort of have to respect those in a way, or else you're going to just be destroyed.
Yeah. I think that kind of really, I think what we see, I mean, I have no way of saying, you would have a better idea, but I think we see the significance of language being more into play. I just have a hunch that history, philosophy, and language is going to have more focus throughout the story. I don't know for sure, but I would definitely hope it, because this is a good topic. With that being said, we do have... pardon?
No, I was just going to say that I think you hit right when you picked the topics for this talk. I think you hit very spot on about the sort of the themes of this book. Definitely history and language, and sort of the teachers and the fathers and the figures. I think you did a very good job picking that out.
No, yeah, thanks. I had to read it twice to, just really confirm it. Now, we do have 10 minutes before we hit the 2-hour mark. Yeah, just under 10 minutes. And so I guess what I want... And James, do you still want to talk about the Eumeswil as a whole? Because we definitely can. If you and Christian don't have anything else to say about language.
We can do that real quick if you want.
I mean, I haven't exactly read the book yet, so I would appreciate it if you guys didn't give any spoilers or anything like that.
Oh yeah. I only read the first 2 chapters, so I would have to repeat what Christian says. So like James, if we can talk about it without spoiling, that would be great. Just from, I guess, Eumswil, from our impression of the first chapter, would be great.
Sorry, I've been mute this whole time because I haven't read the teachers yet, but can I go back onto that language point that you said about sort of liberation, the meaning of language?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Sure, go ahead.
Because you said that if someone wants to be truly free of this meaning that's being lost in language, they can still read up on the etymology and meanings that the word used to have. But the problem still exists that they can't give that meaning to others without teaching the etymology. They're still confined in what they speak to others because those meaning of words have been lost, and because of that they've lost some of their own freedom to actually articulate themselves in their society. So how do you exactly combat that lack of freedom? Because reading up on the etymology doesn't seem to do that, in my view.
Well, Christian and James, if you guys disagree, you can pitch in. But with my answer, disagree with my answer, you can pitch in. But from what I understand, reading the chapters, he doesn't really care about being in harmony with other citizens of the society for its own sake, unless it directly benefits him. And so, as long as he knows the etymology, and as long as he knows the meaning, that's all he cares about. Even if he can't use it to other people, even if other people wouldn't understand him, that's not really of concern to him. It's just he has to be aware of the true meaning. And so that if he ever stumbles upon another person that uses that meaning, then he could be like, oh, aha, I can connect well with this guy. And I guess that's how that's proven by how he picked Vigo and Bruno as his historical and philosophical teachers, right? Martin himself knows history and philosophy to some extent. That's why he knows what to look for. But he's not going to force other people to become the next Bruno and Vigo. He's going to find it. If he finds it, he finds it. And if he doesn't, well, tough luck, right? I don't think he finds it as problematic that other people won't know the meaning, even though he does. That's my take.
Yeah, I don't think he's too concerned with total freedom in the sense that he'll be able to use his own language and express it to everybody. Again, the Anarch is a very personal thing. It's something that you sort of have to hide and keep for yourself. It's about keeping yourself sovereign over yourself, rather than any kind of anarchist where the anarchist sort of senses that power, but then tries to bring it to the whole world, and in the process just destroys himself and everything. So, in a sense, yes, his freedom is limited. He can't just study this history of this language and then bring it to the whole society and give it to everybody and operate freely in that sense. But that's not the freedom. That's a utopian freedom, right? I mean, language in itself, it will always be limiting in some sense, and that's just one of those realities that again the Anarch accepts, which the anarchist does not.
Exactly. Yeah. Does that answer your question, buddy?
Yeah, that does. That's great. Thank you. You can call me Elliot, by the way.
Cool. You could just change your nickname so that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, wait. So is your name Kohei? Just.
Yep. Nice to meet you.
Yeah. Nice to meet you. So, was your point saying that Manuel almost uses the meaning of words to pick out his friends and almost trying to see who he connects with through words? And if you are trying to articulate that, what sort of meaning would that have for Manuel? Do you think?
I wouldn't say he is trying to find the true meaning of words just to be like, all right, man, who's on my side? Who's my friend? Who understands me on my level? It's more so, I want to know the true meaning of words so that my options are open. My options are that much more increased. It's not solely for the sake of trying to find friends. It's not solely for the sake of trying to find people he connects with. It's for this. It could be for that sake. That could be an example, but it could be for anything. It could be for his own search for knowledge. It could be if someone asks him a curious question on what this word means, and if he finds that it doesn't harm him to tell him the truth, and he'll say, "Whoa, the word boomer actually came from the word baby boomer. That is the etymological root of it." And the person who asked could be like, "Oh, okay, well, thanks." And so there's no really set, defined reason as to why he learns the meaning of language. Rather, it's there for him to increase the amount of benefits that he can have from knowing the meaning.
Okay.
Yeah. His use of language in this isn't. Language does play a big part in this book, but it's not the central focus, right? It sort of plays in with his historical, metaphysical, and aesthetic thoughts, right? He's not searching out again people who use words similar to him for any kind of political reason. It's just that he sort of senses this is a kindred spirit, right? This is someone who can see the world in a much more interesting way. The Anarch, in a sense, is very aristocratic. It's very, he's not particularly concerned with, for lack of a better term, the rabble, right? He's associating with the best and the brightest of Eumeswil, and they're obviously going to think in very interesting ways. I think when he talks about language, at least in this chapter, he's mostly talking about it as this sort of spiritual force that has further decayed, as just another way to bring in this idea that Eumeswil is this stagnant fossil, which is very much representative of our time.
Yeah. So he doesn't care about associating with all the people. He's very elitist in that sense. Yeah. So does that kind of clear things up for you?
Yeah, that's fine, thank you. Please excuse my ignorance in not reading it yet.
Yeah, no problem. So what time is it? So we just hit the 2 hour mark. James, do you still want? We can if you want. I don't mind talking to 5-10 minutes on Eumswil as a whole, or do you want to cut it here?
I think we did a good job. I think we mentioned it a few times. It sort of mentioned it in the first chapter. Just I don't want to spoil anything yet too much, but it just sort of we've already sort of placed, I think, Eumeswil in the world. It's this very strange place. We're not even certain where it is geographically, and yeah, we sort of know that it's in between certain empires. It mentions the yellow can and the blue can. There's all these, and there's a giant forest, a primeval forest. Again, that'll come into play later. It's already been mentioned, so that's not a spoiler. But there's lots of things sort of
Vague.
it's very vague, and it's very interesting. I've never seen a book like this. It sort of does an excellent. It's a sci-fi novel, right? It mentions the Phonophore. We've sort of mentioned the Luminar that's going to come in. There's lots of strange things that are in play: technology, mythology, history, also fake history in the sense that there's real history and fake history intermingled. It's such a strange world where it feels this could be a historical novel. It could also be entirely fictitious. If anyone's listened to this and hasn't read the book, I highly recommend picking it up because there's almost the makings of a new kind of fiction here, which I've never seen anywhere else. It's so strange and very wonderful.
Because and one thing I'll say is you could almost not quite but almost compare it to Thus Spoke Zaruthustra, the writing style of that. Insofar as in Thus Spoke Zaruthustra, the main focus isn't the plotline of Zaruthustra going down the mountains and teaching his wisdom. It's about the wisdom itself, right? That's the focus, and the plotline is almost just like a foundation just to use as a soapbox for said wisdom, and that's kind of like the story here, where even in the first chapter, like there's no real definitive plot line. Nothing really happens in the first chapter insofar as he's just talking about the past. He's just talking about what's up. This is life. Here's the characters, etc., etc. And I'd say about like 75% of it is just focused on the ideas. It's focused on the philosophy behind it. And in that sense, it's a very unique. It's a very unique way of writing fiction because the philosophy isn't expressed through the fiction. It's almost like a philosophical story. It's almost like philosophy, and it just so happens to be fiction, if that makes sense. The philosophy is the main focus here.
You're right to compare it to Thus Spoke Zarathustra. That's very, that apart from there's only one other book I can maybe think of. It's actually very similar to this. It's called Wisdom of the Sands. It's by a French writer. It's also about like a prince. This one's about a prince who rules over a small, also I think a kingdom in where probably put Morocco, that sort of area, which I think is where Eumeswil is supposed to be placed. Jünger visited Morocco a lot. The title Kashba, that's a very classic name for that. So that citadels in that area. So yeah, I can only think of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Citadel, or Wisdom of the Sands. It's its other title, and this, and yeah, I kind of wish there was more of these. They're a very strange type of book. You're right. The fiction is sort of background to the philosophical and historical musings. Some people could find that boring, I imagine, because there's not much story. It's not a page turner in that sense, but if you're sort of intellectually interested and you want this nice mix of prose and history and philosophy and some interesting character ideas, then there really is only, as far as I can tell, those three texts. So again, if you haven't read this, pick it up. Very good.
Yeah, 100%. I have to agree with you there. Just reading the first one and a half chapters, it already became my favorite, I had to say. And I don't think that's going to change for a long time. So, yeah, when you said you want to talk about Eumeswil, I assumed that you wanted to talk about the location. I think that's what Christian assumed as well. That's why he said, "Yeah, don't spoil anything." But you wanted to talk about the story and like the story type, the as a book, not the location, and that was a pleasant surprise because I had lots to say on that, and I just did with comparing to this book Zaruthustra and how it's a book that's focused. It's more suited to those people with attached to ideas rather than the literature concept of it. And in that regard, it's a unique book. Yeah.
It's also nice. It's nice to have it because sometimes philosophical text can be very dry. It is nice to have these nice ideas put in, like the Condor. The Condor is such a great character, and it was Manuel, and I think Vigo's a great character. So it's nice to have this kind of human element to these very, very complex philosophical ideas.
Just kind of bring it to life almost. Let's see. Now, we are past the 2-hour mark. Let's see. We went over the Anarch. We went over history. No, we went over Anarch. Yeah, we went over history, and then we went over language, and then we kind of talked about the story as a meta, in a very meta sense. Do you have any final things to say? I mean, of course, James, I wouldn't be surprised if you would recommend the book again, but anything on the chapter, do you have anything to say?
I think this was a great first chapter. I think kind of amazing how much was squeezed into it. We almost could have done every single paragraph as an episode, but obviously that would be too much. But that just shows you what's crammed in here. We could come back to this next year. You could come back to this every year of your life and reread it, and even just this first chapter, and there'd be so much. It gets richer every time you read it.
Yeah, you always find something new.
Yeah, I was gonna say every single paragraph has basically maybe hours of context behind it when he describes the wars of Diadochi or the various Greek texts, such as when he was describing his relationship with his father as that with I can't remember his name, but the original Titans.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah, Zeus and Cronus.
Yeah, he mentions a lot of historical context, so even that in and of itself can be so ripe with conversation. So, yeah. Do you have anything else before I close the recording?
No, I think I'm good.
You good? All right. What about you, Christian?
I think that's all. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So we'll be meeting next week. Same time, 8 to 10 PST AM. This time it'll be on chapter 2 and 3, I believe. So stay tuned and I'll have a new set of topics in there. Cool. That being said, I'm gonna hit the stop recording button. So thank you all for coming on here. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you. See you
No
then.
problem.
Okay.
See you guys.